not sure whether I'd describe the housing market as in crisis. There are a couple of problems, however, which are very important. One is that it's now very, very difficult for young people, certainly in London and the South East or other hotspots, to buy a house if they don't have help from their parents. And the second thing, which is really relatively recent, is that suddenly you're starting to see more homeless people on the streets again. So that suggests that you've got the problems you always have if you have undersupply in the market, which is that marginal people get squeezed out. The young people who get squeezed out are the marginal buyers, and the homeless people who get squeezed out are the kind of marginal people in society. I guess there's a third issue that's perhaps come up as well, which is not so much of a crisis, and that's that a lot of people are having to pay an incredible amount of their income in rent. And this isn't so much because rents have risen, it's actually because relative incomes for young people have declined over the last 10 years, and that's why it's left a lot of them paying a lot in rent, and meanwhile they're trying to scrabble around to find deposits. So people often say there's an intergenerational problem, it's the old versus the young. I don't think that's true. I think it's the young who don't have parental help versus the young who do. And that means we're getting a divide in society between property owners and people who inherit property and people who come from poorer backgrounds. There's certainly no silver bullet to solve the problems of the housing market, but there's actually a prior question as to what it is we're trying to do. If you look at a lot of stuff that comes out from government or councils on the housing market, they talk about meeting need. Need would mean that you all had the house that exactly fitted the size of your family. Economists tend to think about meeting demand, which isn't just what fits the size of your family, it's actually what you'd like to have in terms of space. The trouble is, the richer we get, the more space we all want. But if councils only allow building to meet need, that will tend to be a sort of smaller amount, and that will mean that wealthier people will get the space they want, and poorer people will end up not just either not buying a house or ending up with something smaller than they would really like and living in less good circumstances. So again, I think there is a social problem coming up here. How would we deal with this? How might we tackle it? Well, I think councils should think about demand rather than need, so they should look at what's happening to incomes in their area and what kind of houses that means people want. Again, there's often a discussion that what we need to build is a lot of small houses because that's what people starting out in their married life want. Although, of course, people starting out in their married life often then have children and they want bigger houses. And so we manage to have a world in which people say, on the one hand, actually, we need a lot of small houses being built. And on the other hand, they say, actually, the problem is old people stay in big houses too long and they're really needed for families. So they should live in small houses. And again, this is about trying to say, this is how many houses we need, and not think about how many houses economically the population wants. And we've kind of survived. We've been through a long period where we haven't really built enough houses. And so far, we've coped with that. We've coped with it in two ways. One is that, which is not necessarily a bad thing, we've been very good at bringing vacant houses back into possession. So the level of long-term vacant houses in the UK has fallen. The second thing is, of course, that a lot more young people have stayed at home after university. But you can't expect those trends to go on. And so the difficulties that I talked about earlier in the housing market, of the marginal people getting squeezed out from buying a home, finding a lot of their income taken up in rent, or at the bottom end finding themselves homeless, will get more acute if we don't find some way to step up our level of production over the next few years. The difficulty with making policy suggestions in this area is that most policies that would really change the way in which the market works and get rid of the problems I've talked about are policies which would be quite unpopular in the short term, would only bring about benefits in the long term. So one thing, of course, that we could do is we could simply decide to build a lot more housing. That's not terribly popular in a lot of areas around the southeast. And of course, people bring out two reasons why they don't want it done. Firstly, they say it's bad for the environment, but you have to say, is the environmental cost really that big relative to the cost you're putting on people by making them live in unsuitable housing? Or they say, well, actually, we haven't got enough infrastructure. But if for infrastructure you're talking about schools and hospitals, those just are required by a rising population. Where we build the houses just determines where we need them. I think that's a very separate question. So I do think we could build more. And by the way, I think the planning system itself is better than it was when I did my big review of housing in the early 2000s. I think it's easier for developers to get planning and easier for them in places of growth. I don't think we're planning for enough. The planning system has improved. However, I'm not at all sure that we can really build our way out of this problem. Of course, I think we should build more, but I don't think that's the final solution. On top of that, really we need to think about how we tax property. We've got a general problem in the UK now, we know, that actually we probably don't pay as much tax as we need to if we want to fund the things that we think we want, such as really good health, really good education, come to that very good infrastructure. So one of the things we could think about is whether we should tax property a little bit more, whether we should tax people a little bit more for the value of the houses they live in through changing the system of council tax, in making sure that houses at the top of the market pay more in council tax than they do today, or even thinking of things like charging people capital gains tax on their first home. But both those things would be incredibly unpopular. We've just had this big row about business rates, and of course council tax is just rates for residential property. So we know this would be very unpopular, but of course it would be very helpful, because if people were less enthusiastic about rising house prices, and indeed the fact that they were having to pay a little bit more would stop house prices from rising, because these taxes would get capitalised into house prices, help keep house prices down, this would improve access to the market quite a lot. But the government who introduces it would almost certainly lose the next election, because the people coming in would say, elect us and we'll reverse it. So I find it very hard to see a good taxation problem, and that means for me that we will probably carry on not really building enough and somehow struggling to deal with these marginal people in the market. In that sense, I'm somewhat depressed about the way forward. The most urgent change I'd make, I thought the white paper that the government produced at the beginning of 2017 was pretty good. The thing it really missed out was how to think about particularly the area around London in big spatial terms. One of the problems today is that a lot of the weight for planning and thinking about where housing should go has gone down to local authorities. We don't have regional planning anymore. And that's pretty difficult, because local authorities dealing among themselves often don't come up with plans for the right settlements, or particularly don't build in the right areas. We should be asking the question, where should we put a big urban extension with good public transport links? Where could we put a new town with good public transport links? Should we then, how do we buy the land? Should the government, the public sector acquire the land so that the public sector gets the value of the uplift on that land and is able to use it to fund the infrastructure? But that kind of big picture thinking is just missing from the white paper, and that's the one thing I would go for to try and improve things in the short term. So I think you're right. It's true that in areas like London, Oxford and Cambridge, young people will feel there's a crisis, and they will think it's incredibly difficult to buy a house. And that is a problem for those areas and the way in which the economy works. We know that both Oxford and Cambridge, where the main economy in a way is the universities, find it difficult to find places for their lecturers to live. Cambridge is solving it by building a lot of housing on university land. Oxford hasn't really found a way of resolving that yet. And that means that the economy isn't really able to grow as much as it might. So there's a figure that around Cambridge over the last 10 years, employment growth has been, I think, about 7% a year, and housing growth has been 2% a year. Now, 2% a year is pretty fast. The housing stock of the UK as a whole has tended to be growing by less than 1%, so it's growing twice as fast in Cambridge. Still not kept up with employment growth in somewhere that we look to be a really vibrant part of our economy, because it's full of ideas and full of tech and the kinds of things that we really think we're going to need, particularly in the post-Brexit world. So not being able to work out either how to create new hotspots or to support the ones we've got is a real problem between housing and actually the way the rest of the economy goes. And then more generally, over the last decade or so, as interest rates have fallen and long-term interest rates relative to inflation have fallen, of course that's made the returns on housing, if you're renting them, extremely attractive. So people have put much more money into housing because they're interested in doing buy-to-let, big growth in the rental sector. But that's diverted investment away from things that might have been more useful, investment in company stocks, or investment in the kinds of things that we might like, infrastructure, schools and hospitals. You don't think of that as things people invest in directly, but their pension funds might invest in them. But again, to some extent, residential property has been attractive for pension funds as well. So the fact that housing has appeared to be a one-way bet in the UK has, I think, been quite damaging. The thing that's really damaging about that is if we see interest rates start to turn and increase and housing stops being a one-way bet, then actually we will find ourselves worrying about the financial sector again and worrying about financial balance. So an inability to manage our housing market over time to prevent volatility in the market is also damaging, alongside the fact that underlying that volatility we have an undersupply of stock.